April of 1782, following the bloody Battle of the Sank, the British Royal Navy seized a priceless trophy, the Ville de Paris, a majestic French first-rate ship of the line. Heavily damaged, she was taken under tow by two British vessels, bound for England as a symbol of victory. But she never arrived. The official version claimed that the Ville de Paris sank during a storm in the Atlantic. No survivors, only silence. And yet, there is another version, a forgotten testimony, passed down in whispers and later recorded by French Admiral Pierre-Étienne Bourdon. It speaks of something impossible, a colossal creature rising from the depths, the Kraken. This is the story that never made it into the reports, the story the men swore to bury forever.
Welcome to World Files.
The sea was calm. After days of erratic winds and choppy waves, that morning, the ocean seemed to have come to a standstill. Not a breath of wind stirred the sails, which hung limp and powerless. Only the creak of timber and the gentle lapping of water against the hulls could be heard. The Ville de Paris moved steadily, slowly towed by two British ships. It was a massive vessel, still imposing despite the damage it had suffered. We had captured it weeks ago, and now we were taking it back to England as a prize of war. On board, the routine was the same as always. Some men cleaned the deck, others checked ropes or ate silently near the water barrels. The pace was slow. No one expected trouble. Just a few more days of open sea and uneventful duty. Few words were exchanged. Each man passed the time as he could. Cards, dice, the occasional crude joke. Sometimes a story was shared, but most were simply waiting to reach port, collect their pay, and leave the campaign behind. The officers kept order without raising their voices. Everyone knew their job. The captain was reserved, but firm. He had the crew's respect, and that was enough. From the deck, the sea looked flat and gray, the same in every direction. Only water, sky, and the silhouette of the Ville de Paris inching forward through a vast nothingness. Nothing out of the ordinary. By midday, the heat had grown oppressive. With no wind, the sun poured onto the decks like molten lead. Some sailors sought shade near the masts or covered their heads with damp cloths. Others simply endured in silence, already used to discomfort. We ate what we had, hard biscuit, salted meat, and warm water from the barrels. The officers took their rations separately, but there was no luxury for anyone. It was the same meal as always, with that dry, briny taste that seemed to coat everything. Aboard the Ville de Paris, the sentries kept to their posts without much talk. A few of our men went back and forth between the towing ships and the captured vessel to check the lines and keep an eye on the few remaining prisoners. Most of them were weak or sick. No real threat. By mid-afternoon, the sea remained still. Just the occasional ripple. No gulls, no flying fish, nothing, but no one mentioned it. Not because it was strange, but because at sea, when all is calm, it's best not to tempt fate by naming it. The cannons were checked, a routine procedure, cleaned, counted, but no one expected to use them. Just protocol, like inspecting the ropes or double-checking the emergency oars. From the quarterdeck, the captain monitored our course through his spyglass. He spoke little, as always, jotting down each heading and hour in his log. The sails still hung loose, but the tow held steady. Slow, yes, but steady. Everything was going as planned. The day passed without incident, and as night fell, only the sounds of the sea and the changing of the watch remained. Still, everything was calm. Dawn brought the same eerie stillness. The sea was smooth as glass, the sky clear, and a pale sun offered little warmth to the cool morning air. The ship's routine hadn't changed. The men continued their duties, checking lines, inspecting sails, and keeping watch with quiet focus. But something subtle, almost imperceptible, spread through the crew. A different kind of silence. A pause in conversation. A glance over the shoulder. as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, though none could say what. They looked at each other sideways, unwilling to voice the unease. The captain, standing firm as always, stared at the horizon with less detachment than the day before. His orders were clipped, deliberate, obeyed without question. Discipline remained, but the air felt heavier. Later in the morning, a few men began to notice an unusual smell, faint at first, but unmistakable. It wasn't the typical scent of salt and damp wood. It was something subtler, harder to place, that stirred a faint queasiness in the gut. The older sailors exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The Ville de Paris still moved forward under tow, seemingly undisturbed. The day unfolded with the same rhythm, but the sense that something was about to shift grew stronger, an unspoken tension rising by the hour. By late afternoon, a breeze finally stirred, barely enough to flutter the sails. The sea, undisturbed for days, began to show small ripples. It offered a hint of relief to the coiled tension, but the calm was only surface deep. Something lurked beneath. As the day wore on and the heat began to ease, that strange odor, once barely noticeable, grew more intense, more unbearable. It wasn't the brine of the sea or the scent of wet timber. It was a deep, rancid stench, as if something long dead and forgotten was rising from the depths. The sailors breathed it in with growing discomfort. Some frowned, others scanned the horizon. Though few spoke, unease passed through the crew like a whisper. Murmurs began to stir. What was that smell? Was it a warning? Near the Ville de Paris, the surface of the sea began to shift oddly. Slow, deep undulations that didn't match the wind or any known current. It was as though the ocean itself were breathing, something vast stirring below. The shadows these swells cast gave the impression of enormous forms sliding just beneath the waves. The crew fell silent, watching with mounting dread. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air more suffocating. Routine began to crack. Glances turned wary. Movements slowed. The once peaceful deck now felt tense, charged with an anticipation no one could explain. Still, nothing happened. But the stench, no longer a simple nuisance, settled over the ship like a dense, invisible fog. It wasn't just foul. It was wrong. The very air felt sick. It smelled of ancient rot, dead seaweed, and corrupted flesh. But there was something else too, something nameless, as if it came from a place no sunlight had ever reached. The men said little. Some tried to stay busy, scrubbing harder or rechecking knots that had already been secured. But the discomfort lingered, as real as the smell. The sea's strange breathing continued, soft, round pulses, untouched by the non-existent wind, as if the ocean itself were waiting. One grizzled sailor muttered that the sea was too quiet, a predator's quiet, like the stillness in the woods before the kill. No one replied, but many froze for a heartbeat, listening for nothing. The Ville de Paris kept drifting, slowly, steadily. But no one looked at it now. All eyes were on the water, on its shifting shades, on the shadows beneath the waves. Shadows that might not have been there, or maybe they were. And then, without warning, came the roar. It wasn't a sound in the usual sense. It was a vibration in the chest, in the ribs, in the teeth. It wasn't heard. It was felt. A monstrous bellow, as though a mountain had groaned beneath the sea or the world itself had cried out. And then chaos erupted. Men ran in every direction, pushing, stumbling, screaming. Some dropped to their knees, praying loudly, mixing psalms with half-remembered sailor superstitions. Others formed haphazard circles, marking the deck with chalk or knives, drawing symbols only they seemed to understand. One began singing a nursery rhyme through sobs, rocking back and forth as he repeated the verse. Another tore his shirt and tied it to a rope, waving it toward the sea in surrender or supplication. A group slapped the deck rhythmically with open palms, as if to ward off the beast with noise. Some spat on the wood. Others clawed their own arms, offering blood. One claimed he'd seen it before, In another storm, on another ship, he shouted nonsense orders, insisting everyone throw themselves into the sea before it was too late. No one obeyed, but his screams fed the growing panic. An old sailor clutched a bone-carved cross, mumbling in a tongue no one recognized. Others followed suit, pulling out talismans they had never shown before, as if these trinkets were the only shield against what was coming. No one knew what to do. No one understood what was happening, but everyone, without saying a word, knew something was coming. Something the sea could no longer hide, and then we saw it. First, just a shadow beneath the water, immense, impossible, gliding slowly beneath the still surface. Then, a tentacle broke through, not an ordinary one, a monstrous thing, lined with suckers the size of plates and oozing sores that pulsed with foul, viscous fluid. The tentacle rose slowly, dripping thick, black water, as if the sea itself had spit it out. It moved with a deliberate, almost mocking slowness, and when it came crashing down on the deck of the Ville de Paris, the impact was like a thunderclap. The planks splintered, the masts trembled, the tentacle gripped with a force that seemed unearthly, squeezing the wood with such violence that it began to creak, as if it were alive. Screams, more screams. Some men tried to flee, others threw themselves to the ground, covering their heads, but no one could look away. And then the body emerged, not fully, never fully, as if the sea itself were trying to hide it out of shame or fear. But enough. Its skin was a mixture of torn scales, swollen flesh, and patches of seaweed that moved on their own. And in the middle of that grotesque mass, two enormous round unblinking eyes bulged like cursed lanterns. They were a dirty yellow, lidless, and reflected the light with a chilling intensity. They did not blink. They only stared, fixed, as if judging us from another time. From its enormous lipless mouth hung rows of irregular deformed teeth, some broken, others absurdly long. It breathed like a dying beast with a wet, cavernous sound, and each exhalation carried the stench of death and the abyss. It clung to the Ville de Paris as if it knew it, as if it were claiming it, and no one dared to move. The tentacle tensed. The Ville de Paris groaned like a wounded animal. The wood split under the monstrous pressure. Splinters flew, and an entire mast came crashing down with a dry crack, crushing two men who didn't even have time to scream. The Kraken squeezed the hull, as if it were old, soft prey, and the ship moaned with a sharp, almost human sound. From the towing ships, the commander hesitated no longer. "Fire!" he roared. "Fire at will!" Cannons thundered from both flanks. Iron shot tore through the air, some striking the creature's repugnant flesh. But it was useless. They bounced off. Some embedded themselves barely a few inches into the soft skin, doing no more than drawing a faint grimace from the beast. Its hide was like living wet stone, thick, soft on the surface, but unbreakable underneath. And then the Kraken turned its head, slowly, just a little. One of its enormous eyes, lidless, emotionless, settled on the towing ships. There was no anger, no fear, only an ancient awareness and a certainty. It had seen who was attacking it. Panic erupted. One of the gunners dropped his match and collapsed to the deck, screaming. Another dove into the sea. No one shouted orders. The officers were as pale as the sailors. It was as if that gaze had hollowed them out from within. The captain of one of the ships, with a dry voice, gave the only order that might still save them. "Cut the lines now. Full sail. Get us out of here." The sailors ran to obey. Knives, axes, anything they had on hand. The cables linking the towing ships to the Ville de Paris were severed in seconds, and as soon as the last one was cut, the sails were hoisted clumsily, reaching for a wind that had not yet fully risen. But it didn't matter. They had to move. They had to flee. Behind them, the Ville de Paris trembled under the weight of the beast, which had begun to sink it with the cruel slowness of something savoring every second of destruction. And the men fled, without looking back, as the towing ships sailed away at full speed. trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the horror they had unleashed. The wind finally rose, but it brought no relief. It brought voices, screams, human wails of pleading, of utter terror, rose from the distant sea, where the Ville de Paris struggled not to sink under the Kraken's massive weight. They were the voices of men calling for help, begging for their lives. Voices no one could forget. The sailors aboard the towing ships wept. Some whispered prayers, others said nothing, only held themselves, trembling. No one could look back. No one wanted to see what they knew still lingered behind. Hours passed before anyone spoke again. When the sun was already sinking toward the horizon and the sea seemed calm once more, the captain gathered his officers in his cabin. They were all pale, their eyes red, as if they had aged years in mere hours. "What will we say when we reach port?" one asked, not lifting his gaze. The silence was long. "The truth will do no good," the captain said at last. "No one would believe us." There were slow nods. No one argued. "We'll say a storm sank her," added one of the officers. "That the Ville de Paris was lost to bad weather. That we did everything we could." And so it was. Days later, when the towing ships reached port, one of the first questions was inevitable. "Where is the Ville de Paris?" The captain, voice steady and eyes fixed on the horizon, answered, "She sank in a storm." And they said no more.